Hello and welcome. We're going to give people a few moments because we know it is the top of the hour and it always takes people a second to come in, and we welcome and recognize that the topic for our community table today is probably a harder topic for people to just jump into and have a conversation about. And I think that's why we think it's a really great one for us to create some space and have a conversation with. So we thank everyone who's joining us and who's going to join us here live in our Zoom meeting. And for those who might be signing on and watching us live today, um, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sunita Chandy. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist here at Artesian Collaborative. I'll let my colleague, Ina, introduce herself.
Hey y'all, my name is Ina. I'm a therapist with Artesian Collaborative and I do individual couples and family work.
Nice. We're joined here today with a couple of our team members as well. We're thankful that Mel can be joining us as well. She'll be helping us with our Q&A, and we've got a couple of our team members helping out to help make sure all the logistics happen, because we know that community only really happens when a group of us can get together to get anything done. And that includes having conversations about really important topics. So we'll give ourselves just a few moments to kind of sit back and give people space to join in and get started. But if you're joining online virtually in the live world, feel free to drop in a message of where you're signing in from. If you're here on our Zoom call, you can go ahead and share. I don't know, what's a good question to get us started, Ina?
Um, Maybe how you're feeling about the snow in Chicago this morning.
Oh, that's a great way to start us off. How are you feeling about the snow today? Um, Ina, how are you feeling about the snow today?
Oh, I felt enraged when I woke up. I was so mad. Mainly because we just had such great weather and it's stuck. Like normally it will just not stay, but it actually stuck. It's so I was enraged. How about you?
I know that comes as a surprising thing for me because you are like a born and bred Midwesterner, and like I am a transplant. So I feel like I was prepared for the snow. Like I am like a hawk at this time. Like I'm checking the weather. I like know what is coming. So I feel like I looked outside. I'm like, yep. First day of spring, major snowfall. Like this is Chicago at its normal. Like it's like what you expect in spring is not what you're actually gonna get. So I felt prepared. Mel, it sounds like the snow makes you really ready for summer there. hmm Yeah, I'm definitely feeling ready for summer, but here I feel like I cannot really embrace that until like May because
Yeah,
I'm expecting snow to keep falling until then.
yeah, I won't trust it. And also, I think even as a born and bred Midwesterner, I'm just so sick of it. I'm like, I every year I hope it'll just be a little different. It's not every single year, you know?
Mhm.
So constantly disappointed in Chicago weather.
Yeah. Well, I think that's okay. I think we can be disappointed in Chicago and hope for better. I think
Mhm.
that's a normal thing. What do you think, Ina? Should we jump in and get started?
I think, yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, if anyone joins in, then they'll just hop right in. So yeah.
All right. For those of you that weren't here with us earlier, I'm Dr. Sunitha Chandy, and I'm here with Ina Verk, one of our other therapists here at Artesian Collaborative. And we're really excited to just create a space to talk about some of these topics that we normally avoid talking about. And talking about self-harm often makes people worried that it might cause people to actually engage in behaviors of self-harm. And really, self-harm and suicide often get connected, but many people engage in self-harm behaviors and they don't actually have any sort of suicidal thoughts or desires. And we really realize as mental health professionals that not talking about these topics actually leaves those of us who struggle without support and without resources, without actually knowing what to do. So I really want to invite everyone here who is attending to ask any questions that you have about self-harm, because this is actually how we work through these things. The questions might feel uncomfortable and difficult. And for those of us who might personally struggle with self-harm, and for those of us who might know people, this is the best way for us to work through things. We have a slide and we have information and resources to help you. If the conversation does bring up bigger feelings, we have other professionals on this call who are ready and willing to help you. So at any time that something feels more tense or difficult, you can feel free to send a direct message to either Mel or Sathara, who are on this call, and they're going to send you some of that information right away. But we want to talk about what we can do just to help us jump into this conversation, because we know it can be difficult. So I'm going to share my screen here to kind of get the conversation started, help us get a little bit comfortable. So we're going to use this tool called Slido as we kind of go through the beginning part of the conversation, because some of us are new here to each other, and sometimes it can be helpful for us in a tense and difficult topic to have a safe and confidential way to share some of our thoughts and viewpoints. So I'd love for you all to just grab your phone if you have it with you, or open another tab on your browser and just type in the code that you see on the screen, or I'm going to do it right now. Scan that QR code and that'll just get you into our Slido platform. There's a Q&A section here so that you can ask any question that you have anonymously, but we're going to invite anyone who's joining in on our Zoom platform today to feel free to come off mute and ask any questions that you have. But if you are more comfortable, you can just type that question here. You can send it in anonymously or with your name. We want people to have as many options of ways to share questions and thoughts, but this is the community table. And so your voices and what you bring up, that's really important for us to hear and to learn from, because that's powerful. We learn the most from one another. We want to share some of the information we have, but we know that there's such great resources out there and stories that we need to hear so that we all can grow.
Yeah. All right. So first question that will pop up within the Slido is like, what does self-harm really look like, right? And so self-harm can be something that feels really scary or confusing, and is often portrayed as something that's really intense physically. And it's also, or simply put, it really is just any behavior that we do intentionally to cause harm to our bodies, our physical bodies. It also is the intentional act of causing this harm to either cope with emotional distress, psychological pain, or overwhelming feelings. So there's the main preface around it would definitely be this intentional action that we take. And so for our next question on Slido, or first one, sorry, what are some of those examples of self-harm that you've either seen or experienced? You can type.
Sometimes.
Go
Oh, go ahead.
I was say you can type in the chat. If you're obviously on the live streams, you can also comment. We'd love to hear your responses. So yeah, binge drinking. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's I think really probably the classic example that comes up for a lot of people. I know for me growing up in the 90s, like that was the thing that everyone was talking about, was cutting and what is going on. Like that's often the first thing that people think about when they think about self-harm behaviors, is often cutting.
Yeah, cutting, burning, drugs, over under eating. I saw that as well. Hitting yourself. Yeah. Like some of these are when they're intentional, especially around scratching, unsafe sex, overeating, restriction of food. Man, these are all some really real and relevant examples of self-harm. The relationship is really, oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is great, Ina. I love how we're both like, ooh, these are really good. We're jumping in on top of each other. What were you going to say?
The relationships one is really interesting. I'd love to get into talking about some of that as well, how some relationships we can contribute to. Some people will even say people pleasing at a certain level can be considered self-harm over time, how it develops and, the intention of that. So, yeah.
I would even say self-deprecating really stuck out to me as well, because I think there are times where some of us, it really feels like we have no control of some of those negative thoughts that we have. They are just in the background. There are some very intentional ways that we say things to ourselves that really do feel like an intentional action we use to either regulate our emotions or to punish ourselves. And I think that's really helpful for us to see, because some of these behaviors on here, I think it really is about that intentionality, like hair pulling. Some of us just have some of those behaviors, like we're not even thinking about it. It's just something that we're doing. Other times it is an intentional act that is about causing some of that pain to help regulate or to shape our behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. So, why do people engage in self-harm? This could definitely be something, if you personally feel like you can share, like if you've ever engaged in self-harm, or maybe if you know someone who's engaged and you've been curious of like why they would partake in that action. Yeah. Relief from
Yeah.
emotional pain. Okay.
Yeah. I feel like this question becomes so important too, Ina, because I think oftentimes for individuals who are struggling with self-harm, one of the hardest things about talking about it is the judgment that they think they're going to receive from other people and the judgment they have,
Oh yeah.
right? When people are like, why would someone do that? Why would that happen? You sort of hit this place of like really understanding the why. And I'm always about the let's not be judgmental about the why, but the curious part, because I really do think that there are some key reasons. And I think it's really important for us to see like, how do some of these behaviors actually help relieve emotional pain? I do think there's a lot of things that cause us pain and distress
Mhm.
that are kind of free floating. There's something really tangible about physical pain or
Yeah.
pain that we can tie to a behavior. And that actually makes a lot of sense to our brains,
Yeah.
which is actually why acts of self harm make a lot of sense to us. And it helps clarify things for us that this is what's hurting us.
Yeah. I mean, that was so wonderfully said in terms of like the the behavior of like the physical action. It almost can maybe not replace the emotional pain, or maybe it can turn that volume down, and but then the pain is like the the burn or cut in your arm, and that's what the fixation or the feeling can bring forth. And so it's oftentimes it is that some of that relief from an emotional pain. It could be a coping mechanism or maladaptive coping, a cry for help. Oftentimes I feel in the self-harm work I've seen and done, it's like punishment. It's like, I deserve this. This is my um my judgment that I get to have to bear. And
Mhm.
or maybe it's just like shoving the knife a bit further of like, this is my negative self-perception and this is who I am. And because they think it, I think it too. And I'll just, you know, reinforce it. Yeah.
Yeah. I also appreciate this response of curiosity.
Mm.
I do think there are times where like we get curious about like, will this help? What will this do? How will this feel? And so some of our self-harm behaviors, they don't actually start with the desire to injure ourselves. They don't start with the desire to cause any distress. There can be a snowball effect of like, I'm just trying something to help us, and
Mm.
the cost doesn't show up until after we've engaged in the behavior. So that non-judgmental picture can be really helpful when there's a curiosity about like, I'm just trying something. I'm trying something to ease another pain, and that is incredibly big. Um, and our next question is a little bit more vulnerable. And for our small group here, I want to give a space to say, like, we don't want to put this in the Slido. That's okay. But I think it's okay for us to reflect on this question of like, have you engaged in self-harm, or do you know someone who has? And I think that's a really good broad place there. And I think it's easy for us, and I'm going to drop my answer in there right now because, yeah, I'm a mental health professional. Like I have worked with many individuals who've engaged in self-harm, but honestly, in my own life, like that has been something that I have dealt with. And it is something that I think is a really healthy thing to talk about because there are lots of factors that come into play about why. And I think there's a lot of shame around that. And I think it can be really healthy for us to understand how do we understand those cycles of shame and guilt so that we can actually build different pathways through it because everyone's story is very unique. And that's the fun part about being a mental health professional. I don't get to go around and take my story and put it on other people, but it actually isn't very rare. And
Yeah.
that's what we wish it was. That there's a lot of factors in our society that actually pull a lot of us to doing things to sort of squash and harm ourselves instead of doing things to uplift ourselves to make things better.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, and I would echo what you've just shared, Steve, of um, seeing people experience self-harm and in my work, I've seen that. And then inwardly in my personal life of exploring, like, I think I'm self-harming, but it looks really different and noticing the differences again with generationally, how it shows up. And also I would even say like culturally, like what are some differences that show up? And maybe, for example, for the South Asian spaces for myself, where I see self-harm look different for men and women and in their presentation, whether it's with alcohol or for, I would say, with some women, not that being submissive is entirely self-harming, but maybe over time, maybe generationally, that is actually incredibly harmful. And it's like an ingrained form of coping that just is consistent. And it's it feels like the only way to process pain is that way. And so yeah, I think I think the vulnerability around discussing it and like bringing into light of this isn't something that feels like only one person in like the last 100 have done it, right? It's, I mean, from the participants here, it sounds like almost 100% of us have either know or experienced it ourselves. So that's pretty big. It's vulnerable to answer that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's okay if some of us sit in that place of, I don't know, I'm unsure, because so much of determining if a behavior is self-harm is intention.
Yeah.
What's behind it, right? Is my drinking self-harm or is it addiction, right? Those are some great questions that we want to actually get into the meat of this and take some time to discuss this more. Ina and I have a bunch of questions as we've thought about this topic that we want to talk about, but what we'd really love is to hear the questions that are coming up from you all, and also to hear your thoughts about this topic and where you're at. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, so that way we can have a dialogue and talk through this and go through those questions. And Mel, if you get questions coming your way, or Sithara as well coming from the live stream, please interrupt us and throw those questions in. Or if you want to jump into conversation, just raise your hand or come off mute. Um, Obviously, I'm great at interrupting Ina, so I can do great at being interrupted as well. Um, so I guess Ina, you had mentioned actually earlier when you were talking a little bit about how you're noticing these generational differences. So I'd actually really love to hear more about that because I'm really fascinated about some of that and how culturally, generationally, self-harm just isn't looking the same.
Yeah. Well, I have to admit, like I teeter that Gen Z millennial. I'm like born 98. So technically I am Gen Z, but I feel like I grew up with so much millennial stuff. But the digital age, like, I feel like it just went huge when growing up for me. And it was like everyone was seeing and doing things online. Cyberbullying was even like on 10 by the time I was in high school and in middle school. And so like digital self-harm, I think, shows up for us in more ways than we really think. And a lot of this could look like the consistent view of like those toxic online interactions, even like the nuances of like how your Instagram is supposed to be and having influence and connection, how like that whole like demographic of like how to survive online, if you will, like how to have good aesthetic or all that those kinds of things, can I think we can really internalize that and make this like incredibly negative towards ourselves. Where then the phone or the idea of having connection to people online or just in general, the coping of using your phone for certain things can be incredibly harmful, right? And the best example I can give is like when you're feeling maybe overwhelmed or really anxious by something from work or from a relationship, and over time the coping looks more like I'm going to get on TikTok and scroll for 3 hours because I can't face my own stuff. And it's just where I release my emotional distress. And I actually saw someone share this online recently where it's you're not maybe you're not releasing your emotional distress, you're just consuming somebody else's life, but you're not facing what's really happening internally for you. And over time, like that kind of self-harm is like every single inch of I'm really hurt, I'm really overwhelmed, I'm going to pick up my phone and scroll or let it kind of be what numbs me. And but the content that's being fed is definitely tailored towards probably your algorithm and what's going on internally. Somehow our phone knows everything about us, right? And I think just in general, sometimes online we see exposure to what we call like this perfect life, a lot of comparison culture. It can just be a place where I would say Gen Z and Gen Alpha is consistently striving to meet the mark of like perfection, and the constant con, consuming it is really, I think, can encourage some of that self-sabotage or negative self-perception or like lowering your self-esteem. And I think another thing too is there are a lot of hidden online spaces. Like there are certain forms of Reddit, Discord, like places. I mean, that's just like public, but the other stuff that we don't even, that's pretty hidden, also really harmful places where I think Gen Z and Gen Alpha can find that to be a place to maybe process, but maybe the resources or maybe just there's not a lot of safety in those kind of groups, right? They're not really, I don't know if that makes any sense, but I guess that from what I've seen that. And I think also the doom scrolling is like a pretty common Gen Z, Gen Alpha term next to what I'm hearing now from my younger sister is bed rotting all day long of how, or I think millennials would say we're vegging out or just kind of chilling all day, but more so in the space of like, I won't leave my bed. Like I won't eat. I will stay asleep for the next 8 hours. I've woken up, done some morning stuff, but I will succumb to my place of safety, which might be my bed, and can't accomplish any tasks. And a lot of it is what I would say is the consistent pattern of maybe just trying to escape and like and really press away our internal experience and maybe consume something else. But over time, that could really build some of that negative and digital self-harm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the way I've seen it for people is like, what are you looking for when you're looking online? And I have seen it for just in a lot of like different people I've worked with. It's like, are you looking at other people's feeds and saying like, they are happier than me? They have the things that I will never have and that I don't deserve. Now, no one is, well, I don't know, actually, someone might be directly thinking that thought when they are looking at all these things, but that for me is like, that is the knife you're cutting yourself with,
Mhm.
right? That is the comparison. Like, so that isn't just a mindless, like, next video, next video, next video, wash over me. There is something scratching against you every time you look at that to sort of like justify where you're at too. And that there's a sense of like, what direction are you going? Are you being like, oh, it's so beautiful to see all those videos of vacation sites and like happiness versus like, this confirms what I am and my
Yeah.
worth. And I think that is often where you see the harm of
Mhm.
like, oh, I'm just laying in bed and taking care of myself versus like, I am what should be here. And I think that that is part of those generational risks of where something can be neither good nor bad.
Mhm.
It's how we use it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I was just going to say too, like if you're scrolling on something and you see like, oh, this person's body is perfect and I look like this, and maybe not the initial thought comes right away, but the more we scroll, like the slight internalization will happen over time. And eventually it'll feel like my life is the worst. Like I look so ugly. I'm not skinny enough. I'm not this enough. And then the question of how did this thought even get here? Like what informed that? And a lot of it is the content consumed. And again, those comparison pieces of like, wow, like she did her day in the life and she did 20 things before 9 a.m. And I'm like, I just woke up. I didn't accomplish anything. And we can have these internalizations of how we're not doing enough things. And that seed, I think the more we feed it with scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, that seed's gonna grow. It's like a pretty negative, self-harming tree, if you will. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting that you bring that up because another question that we had was how do you help clients identify and manage triggers for self-harm? So like how do you help someone, okay, recognizing that, okay, this behavior is happening, I'm doing these self-harm things. How did I get here? What happened before this? Obviously this will reflect the different patterns or the different types of self-harm, but what are some ways that clients can, or anyone can, focus on identifying those triggers and finding a different path?
I love that question in general because I think there's a sense of like, how do you identify the trigger? I think even too, it's like for some people, it's like, how do you identify the harm? Because
Mhm.
I think there's the accountability, like I am doing something that is harming me. I know your example is great because I don't always know if there's recognition in those behaviors that like this is a behavior that is harming me. And so in the moment, for some of us where we're like, oh no, I'm very aware that what I'm doing is harming me. Um, how do you walk it backwards to identify the triggers? Um, the first, this is, and I know I would love to hear your like thoughts on this. The first thing for me in the work that I've done is like the first thing we've got to do is be able to lift a really big cloud of judgment.
Mhm.
Because part of the reason why we even got to the place of harming ourselves is we made a pretty hard judgment
Yeah.
at that point. We either judge like, I can't handle this. Um, I don't deserve this. There's something wrong with me. And there is something, I did something wrong. Like there was a very strong judgment. And like sometimes there might have been accountability we needed to take. There was something really horrible that happened to us. Like there are some valid things absolutely in the mix. Um, so this I find actually probably one of the hardest parts is like being gracious to ourselves, realizing we're people living in a very complicated world with very complicated things and very complicated pressures on us. Like, um, for everyone I can see right now, we're all looking pretty nice because this is a nice professional sort of thing that we're also trying to be casual with. No one's got their hair up in curlers and some like weird goop all over themselves because we felt like we needed to show up a certain way. And that's sometimes we have a hard time showing up a little raggedy and being like, that's okay, that's still me. So to identify our triggers means like we got to give ourselves some of that grace.
Mhm.
um, but then I get super behavioral. I'm like, let's walk it back. Let's just talk it through. What happened? When did the behavior happen? And whatever triggered it probably happened within the 24-hour cycle and maybe less.
Yeah.
So we're just going to talk through what all happened in the system, what were you feeling, what were you thinking, what were you doing? And we're just going to investigate. And then we're going to look at where can we put care, other thoughts, other actions, other behaviors, and we're going to experiment. Um, that's I like to get really detailed like that because I think it feels tangible, it feels doable, it feels empowering. But I don't know, Ina, for you, because there's a million ways for us to work through some of these things. How do you
Yeah.
like to do that?
Yeah. I think when we explore like identifying triggers or maybe saying, is there a pattern of some of these things? Whether you're working with a therapist or maybe you're just tracking it on your own and you're like, you're maybe saying, I think I have a pattern of maybe doom scrolling before I go to bed to decompress, or I intentionally binge drink when I'm around certain friends that make me feel, insecure or something, or like some of that stuff is noticing, can you look back at time, like the last 6 months, and see if is there a pattern, like what feels really similar? And then if we can break down that pattern even more, like were there certain events, and maybe exploring some of that. I would even argue like, for some cisgender women, has any of this tied up with your cycle? Like during your luteal phase, do you feel like you harm more to yourself when your hormones are in a different position, or and you're feeling a bit lower before your menstrual cycle? That could be something to consider if there's a more of a heightened emotion to punish yourself or to kind of feel emotional release in a certain way. So there's some discernment there of like, is there, kind of look at a pattern over time, and like maybe breaking down some events, like a timeline could work well, of like the first time I think I self-harm and maybe the second time, and what were some major events that could have influenced said action. So I think maybe the reflection piece could be helpful, looking back and seeing if there's some patterns. I also think for myself, what I did, because I definitely felt like I had a pretty strong phone addiction. I actually told my friends, I'm like, can you tell me when I feel like I pick up my phone, whether it's in a conversation or if it's like, I'm sad. And they're like, sure. And then the more they said it repeatedly, like consistently telling me, hey, you're picking up your phone again. Like, are you okay? And I'm like, why did I do that? Oh my gosh. Like, and then I kind of realized it was like second nature for me. It was, and it's sad to say, it was almost like breathing. It was like I was picking it up, trying to cope consistently with whatever anxious thought that was coming up. I was almost desensitized to it. But sometimes we can be partaking in it for so long, whether it's not just our phones, but something else entirely, with the self-harm behavior, that we can be so desensitized to it, it doesn't even feel painful anymore. And then we're kind of chasing that emotional relief at a higher level. And so I think it's worth it to be like, can I invite someone in to maybe help me recognize it, someone who I can trust, who wouldn't judge me, who would come forth with like hey, I know that this is something that you want to grow in and something that you want to change the behavior. And can I give them permission to speak into that part of my life? Like that could be something that could be really helpful. And that could also be your therapist. But I think having a friend who feels really safe, that could be someone, but also the looking back at time of like, is there a pattern where I've noticed myself cling to said behavior over time? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing that. Kind of as you have been talking about all the different types of self-harm, it can just be a heavy topic across the board. But as we kind of discussed at the beginning, things like cutting was the immediate thought for people about self-harm. And so someone had asked in the chat to talk about how does self-harm like that and suicide differ? So when we're talking about things that are getting much heavier and talking about suicidal ideation and suicide, can you give your thoughts about that?
Yeah, do you want me to jump in and take this, Ina? Do you want to
Yeah,
start?
I'll follow your lead.
Yeah, I think it's really easy. And I would say, especially for people who haven't ever had like a thought about self-harm, or maybe just that don't know anyone who's experienced self-harm, it's really easy to equate like someone's doing something to hurt themselves, or they're cutting. This must be an action where they want to end their life. And I want to say that's when we talk about suicide, or suicidal behaviors or suicidal thoughts, like there actually is a really big difference between self-harm behaviors and self-harm behaviors with the intent to end your life. And we as therapists do take that much more seriously. But there's a whole range around suicidal ideation. Like people have thoughts sometimes about passive suicidal ideation. And the way I've often been trained, and this is one of the areas that just spent a lot of time working in, is that self-harm differs in the fact that it's often around emotion regulation. It's often around the immediacy of pain and trying to address that pain, either because there's something about punishment, it's about I'm feeling something intensely and I'm trying to calm it down, or I'm trying to make sense of it. Um, Suicide is often a solution to a problem. It's a permanent solution. And that's the difference. And sometimes it's just a thought and it's like, ugh, I just wish I wasn't here anymore. And people are like, no, 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 I'm never going to do anything like that. All the way to someone having actually active thoughts. Some people are very distressed by that. And some people aren't. And our goal as therapists is to make sure people have a million other options.
Yeah.
Because there are a million other things to try for that, and lots of things that you can do. But with self-harm, we're often talking about, I have this pain that I don't know what to do with. And I don't know how to handle it. And oftentimes these are ways in which the pain is showing up. Um, and sometimes it's not in our recognition that there is anything else we can do with it. And so we really do in the research world, in the field, make a distinction. There are times where someone is self-harming and struggling with suicide. So we do see that combination that does happen. So you will have someone who is cutting and they are self-harming and they're struggling with suicide. It's actually why we want to have these conversations. That's why we don't want people to be afraid of talking to someone about it. Again, that's where this fear is. If I talk to someone about it, they're going to want to do it more. And there's actually really easy ways to talk about it, because oftentimes we want to tell people like, don't do that. That's bad. Stop it. Well, oftentimes when we feel that way, we're like, well, I'm never going to tell you about this again. I feel really bad. There usually is a reason behind a behavior. And so we can validate someone like, hey, you must be in a ton of pain to do whatever is going on. Like, something is happening to cause this to be the solution. We don't have to know what it is. We don't have to understand it, but we can always seek to understand. Like, hey, can we talk about it? Can you help explain this to me? Can you help me know what to do? But they may not be able to tell us anything about what to do. But we can use all of our insight about who they are and kind of step in to be like, I know that when Mel kind of gets sad, she kind of isolates. So I'm going to call her. I'm going to go knock on her door. I'm going to come stop by. And yeah, I'm worried about her. And then she might get pissed at me. But then I can say, well, Mel, I'm worried. I don't know what's going on. So this is where we step into that relationship with the people we're with. And that's going to be very different with different relationships.
Yeah.
But I'm a fan, actually, if we're worried or we're feeling nervous, no, we're at the community table. Like, this is someone we're in a relationship with. We're actually allowed to tell the person we're in a relationship with that we're worried about them.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I definitely think that like again, like the skills around validation, it isn't telling someone that their behavior is good or that like that you're fine with it. Like you're giving them, okay, great, go and do that harmful behavior, right? That's not what you're doing by validating them. It's seeing their pain, and whether you understand it, whether you can make sense of it, it's naming that their pain is real and that they matter. And the goal, I think, for any friend or therapist isn't that you change the pain for them. It's the calling out of like, said doom scrolling isn't going to take away the pain, or drugs won't change the fact that so and so passed away, or like some like it won't. And I think it's the relational piece where with safety of revealing like, hey, there is you're trying to soothe, and I hear you, and I see that you're hurting, and I also know that I'm watching you maybe hurt even more in that process. And I think it's the gentle like accountability and calling them out in a way that they feel like, okay, this is like okay if I out loud say that I'm having a really hard time and I'm choosing to numb with this said action. Yeah.
I really love your examples there, because you named a bunch of things that people have no control over. And I think we really forget that, especially for the people who are struggling with self-harm, is some of the stuff that is really causing this feeling of overwhelm is like, you can't do anything about it. Like, you lost someone you loved, you can't bring them back. And so you're feeling overwhelmed and heartbroken. why wouldn't you want to numb from that? Or why wouldn't you at times be feeling incredible guilt because the last thing you did was have a horrible argument with them and you said things you regret and you can't take that back, right? And I think when we can be someone who says like, hey, that was really painful. We get that you want to erase that pain. And this is community, like, and it now is terrifying us that you're hurting yourself or I'm pissed. And we're not always scared. Sometimes we're angry that something is happening. I think it can be really helpful to name like, hey, there is a ton of pressure right now in your community, from your family, from your workplace, and it's actually not just disappearing. And what can we do? What can I do? How can I try to deal with it in a way that isn't hurting me? Can also be a good validation. That sometimes validation is naming that this is actually hard. This is actually painful. Because self-harm sometimes is trying to validate that your pain is real, but it's doing it by actually causing you damage. And so there is this interesting part about, can we validate that this pain is real without damage, right? I do think there's a really big place of like, we do need validation, and that sometimes for us, when we're trying to help someone, we can be that person. But I actually want to put that accountability on us too, if we're catching, oh yeah, I am struggling with this. Like, self-compassion is one of the hardest things to do. But sometimes we don't have to start with like, you're great and you're worthy and you're wonderful. We can actually start with like, this is hard. This is really happening. This is really difficult. Oh, and I'm dealing with this difficult stuff with other people. That actually can bring a form of soothing to us as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I know for our time together, we do have a skill we'd like to show you guys and process through with validation. And there's a script that we've made. We would love to just maybe quickly practice it with you, or I can give up the example, see if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Like for example, the one around my parent died. And so I'm choosing to, I've been numbing or taking drugs or drinking alcohol. So for example, that could look like saying, like, I understand I did this, like I did this to turn off the pain of what it felt like to lose a parent. And like I wanted to punish myself because I couldn't give them all the things they wanted when they were here on earth. And I'm just trying to find any resolution to the grief I'm feeling. And so that's why I did it. Right. So a lot of this language is like the ability to and maybe even take some of the, like looking at ourselves and like, wow, I did choose to hurt myself, and validating that that was a behavior I took, but then also the experience of why, and like holding the why of turning off the pain, the calling for help. I wanted to hurt myself. I trying to grieve. So it's one example. And I think if for example, if I was a friend telling my friend Sunitha, like I've been binge drinking because ever since mom died. And then maybe my friend could say something like, do you want to do that or do you want me to do it? Sorry.
You're doing such a good job, Ina.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the validation from someone else can really look like, hey, Ina, I can see like you have been really binge drinking a lot, because it's just incredible pain at the loss of your mom. And I'm a big fan of the word and, because like, but is just gonna get Ina, like, forget it. Like, you're gonna say something rude. And like, there are other ways to get relief and care and support. And I know I don't understand everything, but you really matter to me. And I'm here. I'm here for you. Right? Like, that script is just the simple of like, I can see this is what's happening. And there are other ways.
Yeah.
Whatever we think our friend is trying to deal with. And we don't always know what it is. So we don't always have to put an answer there. And I can see this. But we can admit it, like, I don't understand everything, but we're letting you know you matter to me and I'm here to support you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. Again, it's just the whole hope of whether it's yourself sharing or a friend having the response to them sharing, someone else sharing with you, is allowing their experience to be real. And then also I think like holding their reasoning why and like elevating that over like, I can't believe you chose to do this, or like the physical action, more of the internal, like, wow, like your pain was so deep that it was like, this is the only option you thought you had. And I think the affirmation and the intentional support of like, hey, like I see why. And also there are other ways that like I know I can support you with, or I can name for you, whatever. And again, I think that also this is helpful when we think about a certain kind of relationship, but the judgment also I think is a big piece too here. Like if we are the ones who are self-harming, oftentimes like it's judgment that's leading that. I can't talk about this because they're going to judge me. And knowing that judgment won't help me grow, and understanding myself and can help me connect to the care that I do need. And oftentimes we don't know what we need. And that's where I think community is a big piece of this, of like, whether it's a therapist, a friend, a coworker, like someone relatively that you can trust enough who maybe just have the eyes to see like, hey, I think you're hurting. And and how can we have the safe language around addressing it where they can feel vulnerable.
Yeah, I think you guys have brought up two important things of this is not only building awareness about how this looks for us, but it also can kind of extend our awareness to the people around us and really keying into when we might notice these things coming up for them, which is, I think, incredibly beneficial because we can understand it more for us, but then also be able to show up better for the people that we care about. I wanted to kind of combine two questions in the chat. I know we're coming up on time, but you were kind of starting to talk about the skills and strategies. So any other examples of skills and strategies used to help those people navigate through self-harm behaviors? And I wanted to pair it with this question that I thought was very interesting and kind of like a challenge to what we've been talking about. Is there any way you can truly help someone from self-harming?
All right, I'm going to start with the first one. Is there any way that you can truly help someone from self-harming? We have no control over someone else's behaviors. We don't have control over a lot of things. We do have influence. And I think it's okay for us to understand the limits of our influence. And that it is okay that we are also influenced by other people. And the goal is not to manipulate someone into doing what we want, but it is okay for us to recognize that I am impacted by what everyone on this call does. And for those who are much closer to me, those who are on my team, those whom I know, what happens to them impacts me. And it's okay for me to put out there in a very risky way. And I think for those who are trying to speak to someone they care about that are self-harming, we are scared that we're going to say it wrong, that we're going to make it worse, that we're going to cause them to do something to harm themselves more. We cannot change anyone's behavior, but we can care for them. We can show them that they matter. But we can also work in community to support someone and not feel like we have to carry them solely on our backs. And a tool and a tip that I would also add to the mix of like, along with like understanding your triggers and understanding what can support you is joy and building up. This comes from DBT, a life worth living, and things that really help ground you, not to erase the pain, but to help you figure out why it's worth moving through the pain is one of the best things to help navigate why you're willing to travel through. And lots of people who struggle with self-harm may continue to struggle with it, but they continue to find ways to minimize it and to find ways to add in care for themselves. And that's really powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I think I would echo everything that you just said, Sneetha. I do know you have to head off, but I think just to kind of add a little bit more to that question, Mel, regarding skills. I think the validation skill that we've described today, I think could be really helpful. And I think alongside that, there if you're a friend or a family member or even a therapist kind of working with someone or knowing someone who's going through self-harming, I think repetition and consistency really matters, right? And bringing forth the like the awareness, and I think the intentional care of like, I'm noticing my friend or family member partake in the same thing over time, like because I'm noticing it, and I've asked, maybe I asked last week, and maybe I'll now ask in 2 weeks' time if it's getting worse, or I'm seeing maybe the same things of like those checking ins, I think reveal to maybe the person who's self-harming is, oh wow, someone actually really does care for me. They're not presenting it with agitation or annoyance or not frustration, but like, wow, they're noticing I'm hurting. And often the person I think who is probably self-harming or wrestling with maybe some suicidal ideation, or whether it's passive or active, the often internal belief is, I am not seen. No one knows my pain. And so I think if we're on the outside watching it happen, the repetition and consistency of intentional care, checking in, and knowing like that's the right thing to do for any person, right? And it's an expression of how deeply you do want to show up and care for someone. So I think that could be something that's whether it's a therapy skill or a life skill, it's just the consistency and repetition will really matter. I think another thing could be, and I think this would also definitely apply if someone is maybe self-harming and maybe they're in therapy work, there being an exploration around like internal belief system, because there's oftentimes something that is really informing said intentional act of self-harm. That could look like, I I am never gonna have the body type that I want, so I'll just eat whatever I want, and I will just binge drink, and I'll do all these things like that are that could be really harmful to my health, knowing because I am not ever going to be the person that I want to look like, or I'll never be physically the way I want to look. And so like kind of maybe backtracking of like, what kind of I am internal statements do I hold on to that I reinforce? Oftentimes it's like it's ourselves who push the knife in a bit deeper. It's not anything external. And the best way I think with some of my clients, I try to use a reference of like, it's like putting a mirror in before you, and like looking at, if there was a statement written on the mirror, what would it say? Would it be like, I know I'm not enough, or I'll never be what my boss wants me to be. I'll never be good enough for my family, or I'll never be pretty enough. Like there's some form of a statement, like when you look in the mirror, that's informing you of something about yourself. And then that can be reinforced by external circumstances, things that are not in our control, that can just reinforce that harmful thought pattern, and then it becomes our truth, right? And so I think it feels more of like a therapy, like active step of change of like, can I look at that mirror and be like, wow, I do have an internal belief system that is probably harming me the most. And then it's like causing me to choose cutting or hitting my head or burning myself or doom scrolling or binge eating or binge drinking. Like it's causing that for me to do that. Right. There's always, I think there's a seed that's planted for us, and then that takes root, and then the action looks a bit different for us. And that's normally the physical act of self-harm. But I would even argue a lot of that before it's physical, it always will be internal and an emotional like thought or belief that will, I think, inform that external said behavior. So that was a long-winded answer. Sorry. Yeah.
I think that's really important too, to kind
Yeah.
of sum that up as the self-harm is the behavior, but where is that coming from?
Yeah. Well, we do have a little under 5 minutes, so I'm not sure if someone on our team can maybe share the screen for our support resources. I'm having a hard time pulling it up on my end, but I do want to give up some of our supports from us as an AC team. We do have certain crisis lifetime or lifelines and text messages and things that you can do if you're actively engaging in self-harm, or you know someone that like you need to get these resources to. We would love to make sure you have these. And so I'm going to try to pull it up really quick on my end if I can. Let me see if I can get there. So you have it. Let's see. Y'all see that? Maybe. I think so. Thumbs up if you can see it. Yeah. Okay, great. So these are some supports for y'all. And I think this could be a good thing to either screenshot if you need it for yourself or for friends or for family. We want you to be able to have these tools and know that us as a team really prioritize your well-being and just any options or any spaces where it's more community needs that we can give. We like to give those for you. So and then also we would love to for us to kind of get ahead of some of our future spaces that we will be doing. So there will be a survey that we will give to you. And so if you could take a few minutes to complete that. And of course, obviously Artesian Collaborative is a mental health organization that we will translate mental health science into practice. And our goal is to continue to host these kinds of conversations just to see and really be part of our community and give back to the ways that we can. So we want to keep these conversations going with people in our circles and continue our growth. So please sign up for our future groups. You'll get emails and things like that from us. We promise not to spam you a ton, but again, we would just love to kind of keep you in our orbit in terms of the things that we do here. And especially if this was impactful for you or just meaningful in any way, or could be meaningful for someone else. We have a lot of events coming up, whether it's neurodiversity or mom guilt. We've got some cool things that we're doing underneath our belt, and we'd love to have you part of that. So, but thank you again for your time today and your participation. I deeply appreciate that. I know me and Sunita definitely do, and the AC team does. So, but besides that, so thank you again for your time and hope to see you soon.